Hello Year 12 and welcome to this lesson on language and identity with a focus on language and gender, which can be the topic that you choose for your NEA. Here are the sorts of things that might be NEA titles. These are quite general. To make them real NEA titles, you have to make them much more specific. But things like, how do males and females use language differently? Say, for example, on social media, text messages, in conversations or speeches. Or how do males and females communicate differently, say, for example, in conversations? Or how is the language used to describe males different from the language used to describe females in, for example, fiction or in newspapers? So that's the kind of territory that you'll be looking at if you decide that gender is something you'd like to write about for your NEA. What I'm going to do is going to take you through some of the research that's been done on language and gender, which may help you to decide if this is something that you'd like to write about. So we're particularly thinking about, is the language used to describe males different from the language used to describe females? Do men and women use language differently? And what research has there been on these questions? And really, how accurate is it now that we're in the 21st century? A lot of the research on language and gender is from the last century, and it particularly came out of the women's movement of the 1970s, early feminism, where women were seeking equality in work, in payment, in status. And so one of the things that was looked at by these early feminists was language. We may think 50 years on, 40 years on, that in actual fact some of this is out of date now, and perhaps the relationships between men and women have changed so much that the language has also changed. That's a great place for you to be able to investigate. And so your NEA is really finding out something that perhaps hasn't yet been looked into. So if you think about it that way, you don't have to take this research as sort of gold-plated knowledge that can't be challenged. Quite the opposite. You can challenge these ideas. Okay, let's have a look at some of them then. So Robin Lakoff wrote Language and the Woman's Place in 1973, and her starting point for that was that male language was at the time seen as the kind of normative, and that female language deviated from that in the way that it was used. So she actually thought that male and female language was so different, you could have such a thing as a gender-lect, just as you can have a sociolect from different social groups, you can have a gender-lect for different genders. On the next slide, I'm going to show you some of the things that she identified that are different about the way that men and women use language. So let me show some of those. So she believed, for example, from the things that she'd actually observed, that women tend to use more hedges. They will often soften or weaken the force of what they're saying. They'll often say sort of, kind of, perhaps, maybe, rather than being more direct and emphatic, which perhaps might be something that you find in male type of language. She also discovered that women were more polite. They would use more polite forms, whereas perhaps men might be more direct. They would often be perhaps sometimes a little hesitant in their language, turning a statement into a question. Rather than saying, it's a nice day, making a declarative statement, they would say, it's a nice day, isn't it? And invite a response to that. She also recognised what she called emphatic language, that was sort of emphasising particular adjectives. This is so something. And what she called empty adjectives like adorable or sweet or lovely, which are generally positive but are not very specific. She also noticed that women tended to have more correct grammar and punctuation, sometimes hyper-correcting, so kind of over-correcting themselves. And this might be interesting if you think back to Trudgehill's Norwich research, which showed that women were more likely not only to use the ing form of a word rather than the in form, but also they were much more likely to claim that they'd used it more than men did. Um, she also thought that women tended to lack humour in their speech. They would directly quote what other people had said. They had more specialised vocabulary in certain areas. For example, they would know more words for colours or more words for particular types of clothing. She said that often the intonation of female language would be to create a question and that kind of voice going up at the end of a sentence. And also these intensifiers, so, very, absolutely. So, in essence, her portrait of the language spoken by women was that it was, in a way, weakening their position. The politeness, the hedging, the questioning, those types of things tended to make women seem less powerful in the way that they were speaking. She noticed in male language they were much more direct. They would be much more explicit. Rather than a would you mind possibly, it would be give me the scissors. They would interrupt more in conversations, hijack the topic of the conversation and dominate it. They would swear more. They would often tell more jokes and show a better sense of humour. In some fields, they had a narrower vocabulary, for example, in colours and so on. And also, they would use more non-standard forms, more dialect, if you like, so that they were seeking more of the covert prestige of bonding with their peers rather than seeking the overt prestige of those people in status and power, which may be an indication that men didn't feel that they had to prove themselves in perhaps the same way as women did, who felt less powerful. So this is what Lakoff described that she thought male and female language was like in her work. Now, as I said, 21st century, we may disagree with this now. We might think that isn't the case. And later on in this lesson, you're going to have a chance to look at something that might prove or disprove that. Okay then, moving on. So Lakoff saw that she believed that female language was seen as inferior in a way to male language. There were other approaches. And so there's approach of just seeing male and female language as different rather than kind of blaming men. This was just they are different. Deborah Tannen in 1990 wrote a book called You Just Don't Understand Men and Women in Conversation, which pointed out what she believed, which was that men and women use language differently. And because of that, that can lead to miscommunications between them. And so when women say something, it's not always understood because men might misinterpret it. So for as an example, I've had a terrible day at work today, and that might just be an opener in order to open a discussion about that particular day and what it was like and just looking for some sympathy. Whereas it might be taken as an opener, which means I want you to give me some advice, and that can cause difficulties within a relationship. Jenny Coates also observed women in conversation, and she noticed in all female conversations that she felt that women were quite cooperative in their speech, that they tended to negotiate in their discussions, support each other, give way to each other, give lots of positive feedback when somebody else, another female speaker, was speaking, which wasn't the same in mixed sex conversations. So she really was building a lot on Lakoff's work in the sense of women being more cooperative in their language use. Also here in the early 90s, this is a while ago, this is Conrad Kuyper, who studied all male talk amongst a rugby team. And he noticed that men pay less regard to the need to save face and use insults in a way of expressing solidarity. So this was way back in the 1990s. Is that still true today? Is it still possible that, for example, if men within a sports team might call each other nicknames, they might make fun of each other, and that's okay. That's actually a way that they bond, and it may not be something that women within their groups do the same. Also, here we have in the early 90s, Jane Pilkington, who, kind of building on what Coates and Lakoff has said, saw that women in same-sex talk are more collaborative than men in male talk. They will aim for more positive politeness strategies, whereas men are less supportive and complementary to each other. So just as this is just a reminder of what Lakoff said. So it is possible for us to uh, look at this research and say, no, actually things really have changed, and here's my evidence for that. So what I'd like you to do is just remind yourself of these particular features, with female language being less aggressive, less direct, and male language being the opposite. And have a look, there's a link on, if you're watching this as a video, you'll need to go back to show my homework. If you're watching it as a PowerPoint, there's a link here to Love Island arguments. And I'd like you to look at those and say, is it true, based on the Love Island arguments, that this is how men and women speak to each other? So this is the link here. So go away and have a look at that, and then see if you think that's true. And I'll come back and I'll see you in the next slide. So I hope you enjoyed watching those Love Island arguments. So does Lakoff's argument hold true right now? Well, maybe like me, you discovered that it really doesn't. That that isn't the case with the male and female language. In some ways, actually quite the opposite. So why might that be? Well, it could be Lakoff's research is out of date. Women and men are different in the 21st century. All of those decades of feminism have made men and women more equal, and therefore their language is more similar. Or, another possible reason, the participants on Love Island are chosen specifically to be outspoken. They're not actually representative of all men and women. Or maybe the speakers are aware that they are on television and they're projecting a false image of themselves. This may be particularly true of the men who don't want to come across as being aggressive, they don't want to come across as being bullies, and so perhaps they hold back a little bit. And for the women to be outspoken, to be feisty, to be a fiery character actually advantages them. So maybe they build up those aspects of their personalities. But this is the way that research can work, that we look at the evidence that's there and then we find some reasons for why that might be. So I hope you found this lesson interesting, to look at some areas of language and gender that you can explore. And in the next lesson, there are a couple of short activities that you can do to give you a kind of taster of how language and gender might work. Okay, thank you for listening, and bye bye for now.